This is the World Organic News, the week ending 11th of February 2019. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. We begin this week with a couple of stories. One of loss and devastation, and one of apparent mind changing, which illustrates that we might be waking up from sleepwalking into climate change disasters. The first is from the ABC in Australia, entitled Queensland Floods Have Likely Killed Hundreds of Thousands of Cattle, Farmers Facing Catastrophic Losses. These floods are west of the ranges in what's called a channel country. Eventually all the water out there heads towards, but does not always make Lake Eyre. The last big flood in this area was back in 1974. This flood is a metre above that mark, and that was a record-setting flood. 2 weeks ago, the farmers living in the area were crying out for rain. The drought there had been prolonged, even by Australian standards, and now individuals have lost the last of their stock. The process during a drought is to cull down to your best animals, hand feed them and hope to breed up after the rains arrive. Across vast parts of Queensland, there are now only dead animals. To give some idea of land sizes for our American listeners, the state of Queensland is about 2.5 times the size of Texas, and about an area about half the size of Texas is underwater. So I hope that helps. I'm not sure how that relates to Wales for our UK listeners, but you get the picture. It's a big mess. Now, this flooding came suddenly, as I say, following years of drought, and I quote from the Australian Prime Minister from the piece, "This will be heartbreaking to these communities that have been experiencing years of drought, only to see that turn into torrential inundation which threatens now their very livelihoods in the complete other direction," he said, end quote. Tropical monsoons and bare soils are not a healthy combination. The photos in the article are quite confronting. Bloated carcasses and the mud that comes with flooding. There's the usual cash from government in a crisis, and a mob called Rural Aid is running semis of fodder into the area. The army is then dropping the fodder from choppers as the ground is still too wet for vehicles, and all for the stock for that matter. The after-flood death toll amongst livestock is likely to be as high as that caused by the flooding. There's nowhere for stock to lie down, their feet and hocks are in mud. The country, if not the world, will look with sympathy before the next big story. The people on the ground will do what they have to, as they always have. This summer of heat waves, bushfires and now floods, after 2 similar summers, has brought the majority, if it were ever a minority, of the population to the conclusion that all these odd weather events are probably related to climate change. Who'd have thunk it? The curious other thing that's occurring across this wide brown land is a series of elections. A quick bit of background. As in the US of A, the further to the right on the political spectrum a party or individual politician is, the more likely he, and it is usually a he is to claim climate change as a hippie/communist conspiracy. The most far right of the 3 major parties is the National Party, which is a humorous name, given that they used to be called the Country Party and represented wealthier farmers. That they now represent mining and agribusiness might explain their recalcitrance on climate change, you would think. But we have an election happening in New South Wales in March and a federal election sometime before May. This seems to have awoken some of the Nationals, and I suspect across the entire political spectrum. A quote from the Sydney Morning Herald. Quote, "A senior Nationals minister says the impact of climate change on farming is now undeniable, conceding his views differ from many of his colleagues." New South Wales Primary Industry Minister, Neil Blair, said the sands were shifting on the climate change debate as he prepared for a Council of Australian Government's meeting of agriculture ministers in Adelaide on Friday, end quote. We live in interesting times. That a Nationals member could say out loud on the record he thought climate change was real is a thing almost beyond belief, but there you have it. Now all we have to do is convince them of the benefits of regenerative agriculture, and that's game, set and match. I can close down the website and the podcast because the world has been put to rights. Well, maybe not this week, but soon, I hope. Not that I don't enjoy doing this, it's just that I wish things were fixed. There seems to be some hope. It is only once people admit the problem that we can come together and fix it. One Nationals member does not make a summer, but it does represent the first crack in the damn wall of ignorance and moneyed politics. And there's a couple of mixed metaphors for you. It is not just in the antipodes that the obvious is coming into plain sight. From the blog Deep Agroecology comes the piece, Extreme weather and food shocks compel climate emergency plans. Quote, at this point, most of us need to look no further than outside our windows to see that climate change is upon us. For me in New Mexico, the alarming sight of a neighbourhood emergency at the window came last summer in late July, when there was a 1,000-year storm, which ripped up our yard, overflowed the arroyos, inundated the basement of Santa Fe's City Hall, and washed out streets around the region. The storm swamped gardens and farm plots aplenty. From polar vortexes and churning tornadoes to the relentless strings of hurricanes, floods and forest conflagrations, the earth changes of climate chaos are raging. To ignore this rampant reality and to do nothing about it is to invite peril. End quote. These once-in-a-thousand-year events keep racking up in a most peculiar way. I guess if we get them out of the way at the start of the millennium, then the rest of the 1,000 years should be a doddle. The author of the Deep Agroecology blog, Steve McFadden, then goes on to list the following pieces of evidence that things are crook. 5 straight record-breaking hot years, gigantic hole in Antarctica, ice shelf tearing itself apart, and the Himalayas melting. We can add on to this the forest fires and droughts of the last European summer, and the droughts, bushfires and floods in Australia. And there's clearly a need to do something. We could probably also toss in the drought that nearly had Cape Town running out of water as well. It is everywhere. McFadden refers to the Club of Rome Climate Emergency Plan, and I know the words Club of Rome will only confirm for some people the left-wing socialist New World Order conspiracy ideas. But I'm really past caring about that. I'll advocate for whatever works. I've been involved through employment within a few large organisations, and the bigger the organisation, the more incompetent it is. Running a global conspiracy is, to my mind, an impossibility, but that just probably shows I'm in on it, eh? So having actually read the climate emergency plan from the Club of Rome, it seems to be a reasonable approach to the problem. You can follow the link in the show notes. Indeed, I would encourage you to do so. I would also encourage you to read the Deep Ecology blog. Stephen has some really interesting material there. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. Podcasting checklists are still available over at the John Moore Podcasting Services site, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.